Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 15 of Series 7. The question for today is, does Sartre's repudiation of the spirit of seriousness miss a more vital point? Now, Sartre can be understood in comparison and contrast to Heidegger's thought, which he saw himself as taking further. Now, even the title of Sartre's Being and Nothingness is a reflection of Heidegger's Being and Time. But Heidegger regarded Sartre's work as a degradation of his own, primarily about being. Heidegger's conception of being is definitively about being in the world or in this world, but it has been thought of as ontotheological or even cosmological, whereas Sartre conceives of the human being as consciousness or being for itself. Sartre's work is central to my thinking on consciousness and to some extent on value. Husserl and Heidegger preceded him in working out a phenomenology of consciousness. But Sartre's analysis of consciousness is more focused and explicit than Heidegger's Dasein. In this way, I have learned from Sartre, even though I strongly disagree with his views. My own thinking is directed by the question, what can we do with human existence as consciousness? And I find that the problem of human existence as consciousness can be resolved in terms of value. Sartre has some useful ideas about the origins of value as choice, elimination and selection. But I disagree with him on the character of value and the values that we can affirm. My disagreement today focuses on his notion of the spirit of seriousness. Yet this also gives me an opportunity to give an example of philosophy as mythology. That is, many philosophical ideas are mistaken but point to another better idea hidden in the thinker's mind. Sartre repudiates the spirit of seriousness because it inauthentically regards subjective values as objective. He claims that we take subjective values as objective in order to evade freedom and responsibility. Sartre gives many examples, like a judge who says, "I have no choice, I must sentence him to death." But Sartre says he does have a choice. For example, he can resign or he can declare a mistrial. So this is the classic example to regard such a course of action as objectively fixed, and to say that I have no choice when I do have a choice. Yet Sartre's condemnation of taking subjective values as objective applies to choices, principles or objects. With respect to principles or objects, he speaks of refraining from appropriating things for their own sake, and that people should try to realize the symbolic appropriation of these things. I will come back to this mistaken objectification of the value of principles and objects shortly. I first want to focus on Sartre's condemnation of seriousness and inauthenticity as an evasion of freedom. He regards our choices as radically free, and that we create our principles and values in our choices. But we don't have to accept either choices as radically free or the creation of values to agree to their subjectivity. For example, Mackie holds that there are no objective values without having to make these other claims. Yet Sartre nevertheless regards the significance of his insight about values as being about freedom, and he interprets the significance of freedom, perhaps unexpectedly, in terms of ethics. This is evident in his question, can one live this new aspect of being, and I must add, as freedom. And in a subsequent and the last sentence of Being and Nothingness, he promises to write a future work on ethics, but he never writes it. So Sartre sees the significance of falsely taking subjective values as objective in these terms. That is, in terms of inauthentically evading freedom that he sees as leading to ethical issues. Yet there are other issues here that are more compatible with the phenomenology of consciousness than ethics. That is, Sartre speaks of erroneously appropriating objects instead of realizing their symbolic meaning. And he recognizes that such objects have a supportive function, albeit an inauthentic function. But he doesn't focus on either modes of consciousness or its relation with such objects. That is, apart from the inauthenticity of consciousness that regards objects in this way. Of course, in my view, the relation between consciousness and its objects is indicative of something else. It's indicative of a certain sufficiency or a degree of independence from supporting cognitive objects. And I describe that independence in terms of a sufficiency of value. But before talking about that sufficiency, we should look at why Sartre doesn't reach the same conclusion. Apart from his tacit ethical assumptions, we can find two aspects of his thought that explain this. One, his fundamental ontology of the world, and two, his conception of value as a kind of lack. Sartre's ontology consists of a fundamental relation, that is, between what he calls being for itself, or consciousness, and being in itself, or physicality. On this view, physicality has impregnable existence and cannot be deformed, reduced, or threatened. Yet conscious being for itself is contingent, ephemeral, insubstantial, and always at issue. And as such, being for itself seeks the permanence of the in itself as physicality. But this is impossible. Hence, for Sartre, mankind is a useless passion for what he cannot become. Also for Sartre, conscious or subjective being for itself is a kind of nothingness, a lack or desire for being. Moreover, this relation of consciousness with physical being in itself brings nothingness into existence. And Sartre says that nothingness lies coiled in the heart of being like a worm. Sartre may be correct in that an insubstantial consciousness is seeking substantiality, but we might not need to accept his pessimistic conclusions for at least two reasons. One, Sartre's relation between these modes of being depends upon the agent's acceptance of this ontology, and the properties of physicality need not be regarded as definitive human objectives. And two, the permanence of physicality can be replaced with a more appropriate sufficiency of value. I will discuss this shortly, but we can ask, why doesn't Sartre adopt it? My answer is that Sartre's concept of value as a lack, need, or absence doesn't allow for value-based solutions. That is, his is a desire or needs-based theory that defines value in terms of what we want or do not have. This accords with Sartre's attachment to the ideas of possibility and freedom in choosing values, as well as corresponding with Sartre's negative appraisal of consciousness as above. But this view of value fails to account for positive values that light up our world with meaning and purpose. it fails to account for sufficiencies of value like magnanimity, moral fortitude, courage and care. It doesn't account for substantive value states, value satisfactions and value sufficiencies. Desire-based theories of value also can't explain revealed or unexpected values that we don't antecedently desire. Examples of such can be genetically based or aesthetic values that are only valued when they appear. Yet Sartre's negative views of value and consciousness can be seen as consequences of his ontology. But there's an alternative response to consciousness seeking the permanence of physicality. That is, as noted, we place the permanence of physicality with the more appropriate sufficiency of value. But before discussing a sufficiency of value, I want to discuss insubstantiality and the relation of value to objects. Sartre has already described the insubstantiality of consciousness in relation to physical substantiality, and religion and folk psychology has also said as much in less explicit terms. I have previously described the insubstantiality of consciousness as a consequence of certain structures of consciousness. These are structures like graduation, divisibility, temporality and ephemerality. Insubstantiality expresses the ephemeral, the nebulous, the evanescent and tenuous nature of consciousness. It is subject to diminution, cessation, fragmentation and dependency. As I've elaborated on this previously, I won't further describe it here, but I will describe some consequences of insubstantiality for the relations of consciousness with its objects, and both Sartre's appropriation of objects and the existential notion of intentionality are relevant to this relation. Intentionality describes the relation between an internal state and its external objects, and internal and external elements implies structure as well as relation and the character of these elements. In this case, we're talking about the quality of value and its external cognitive objects, that is, values that are more or less sufficient or dependent upon an external structure. Now, these internal and external elements imply structure like a container and its contents. Georges Bataille presented us with a useful metaphor of mind as water in a bottle. In our analysis, the relation is between value states and supportive cognitive frameworks. Our issue is the independence of the value states and the degree of support they require. I previously described this independence as a sufficiency of value. In the language of the metaphor, the liquid in the container can represent mental states of different viscosities. The thicker the liquid or mental state, the more independent it is of external structure. Water will flow all over the place. Hardened cement doesn't need an external structure. Sufficiencies of value will always be somewhere between these extremes. Sufficiencies like moral fortitude, resilience, maturity, self-esteem and courage. This is only a metaphor to explain how sufficiency of value can be an antidote to the insubstantiality of consciousness. We now need to show how this explanation is preferable to Sartre's rejection of appropriating objects. The idea of a sufficiency of value is often misunderstood, but can be contrasted to other kinds of sufficiency. Firstly, it isn't the logical sufficiency of necessary and sufficient conditions. Secondly, neither is it the sufficiency in the principle of sufficient reason. Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason is that everything must have a reason or cause. These are logical or physical forms of sufficiency. But thirdly, a human form of sufficiency can be found in the experiences of pleasure and happiness. That is, the sufficiency of pleasure remains pleasurable regardless of beliefs or social disapproval. Happiness is more subject to cognition, but happiness is still satisfying in itself without endorsement. And fourthly, value sufficiency can also be explicated with reference to happiness and intrinsic value. That is, as previously argued, happiness isn't intrinsically valuable because it's not always valuable. So happiness is intrinsically happy, but it isn't intrinsically valuable. Yet we can say that all sufficient values are intrinsic values, but not all intrinsic values are sufficient values. This is because many intrinsic values are trivial and aren't sufficient as ends like meaning and purpose. And sufficient values are determined by their quality, not quantity, as sufficiency might imply. Neither are they fixed quantities, but depend upon the individual's circumstances. I have also frequently given examples of value sufficiency in terms of positive value states. These are states like self-esteem, patience, maturity, ethical fortitude, magnanimity, and courage. Examples of these states are also very well expressed in religion and ethics. Firstly, the idea of God is a historical development of the believer's highest value, characterized by sufficiency. That is, omniscience, omnipotence, and even perfect goodness are expressions of sufficiency. These ideas are expressed in Anselm's ontological argument for God as the highest value, as well as in Copleston's argument from contingency about the sufficiency of God. And secondly, Aristotle's eudaimonia is the supreme good, which he also qualifies as self-sufficient. And as the supreme God is a moral concept, it can be inferred to be a sufficiency of value. Yet religion isn't explicitly aware of promoting values, and Aristotle wasn't aware of supporting cognitive objects. However, both present value in terms of sufficiency that express strong social and theoretical resonances. Yet with respect to Sartre's misappropriation of objects, we are talking about sufficiency in relation to objects. This was illustrated earlier in Bataille's metaphor of mind as water in a bottle or liquid in a container. Yet we can find particular examples of this relation as well as religious and theoretical ones. My usual example is of a 5-year-old child who needs parental approval not required by a 25-year-old. Yet these examples of a child, religion and ethics show we are dealing with a process of development, and in that development we can see a preference for independence and a sufficiency of value. We are talking about a relative sufficiency of value and its need for some degree of supportive cognitive framework. And that supportive cognitive framework is found in many different forms. For example, the idea of objectivity in the spirit of seriousness, religious beliefs, or in parental or social endorsement. Social esteem and other people's regard is another huge part of a supporting cognitive framework. The many examples of social esteem as cognitive support present an embarrassment of riches. One account of the significance of social esteem is given by Philip Pettit and Geoffrey Brennan. They write that people desire the esteem of others and shrink from their disesteem. And they go on to associate their view with an intellectual tradition that includes Adam Smith, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, the Baron de Montesquieu, David Hume, and they go on just about everyone who is a forebear of modern social and political theory. Another example of the significance of other people can be found in Ryan Brown's book, Honour Bound. Here, Brown differentiates dignity cultures from honour cultures. Dignity cultures derive value from our humanity. Honour cultures derive value from reputation. For example, an award is an honour that would be undermined if everyone was awarded that honour. And we might have intuitive preference for dignitive cultures over honour cultures. So one of our most significant expressions of cognitive support is evidence in our relations with other people. That is, we suffer from a huge, both recognised and unrecognised need of social endorsement. Social endorsement affects our self-esteem, self-concept, and affects us in many other ways. In my view, the replacement of social esteem with self-esteem and sufficient value would have radical social and personal effects. That is, we would all live our lives for the better in different ways and with different objectives. The importance of social esteem for our self-esteem might be agreed without the above illustrations. Yet the above illustrations are intended to be given a deeper interpretation. That is, the relation and dependence of value states on supporting cognitive objects. And the question is whether that account and its conception of value is more comprehensive than Sartre's. Obviously, both these accounts need much fuller presentations that has been given above. But among the issues is Sartre's appeal to ethics and my own circumvention of ethics. And I would want to show the relevance of value sufficiency to a wider range of issues. Yet we can at least comment on Sartre's account of the character and origins of value. We have already noted the weaknesses of Sartre's conception of value as a lack, absence, or desire. But this view also enables Sartre to describe the ambivalence, ephemerality, and obscurity of value. He writes, its being, that is a value, is to be value, that is not to be being. And less, perhaps obscurely, he writes that this is what enables us to conceive why value can simultaneously be and not be. And this view of value is consistent with his view that human reality is a lack, which again is challenged by positive as well as negative accounts of value and humanity. Yet we can also find illuminating views in Sartre about the character of both consciousness and value. That is, consciousness and value are coexistent. Sartre writes that the being of the self as consciousness is value, and that reflective consciousness cannot arise without at the same time disclosing values. and this also provides us with a credible account of the origins of value. Sartre builds on the idea of contrast, choice and selection as constituents of both value and consciousness. He holds choice as not just preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. Sartre wants to trace selection to its ontological foundation, but he doesn't do this explicitly. But we can explain and extend the notions of choice and selection with the concept of contrast. Monotone is inimical to selection, choice, value, perception, and indeed to consciousness. These capacities need contrast like a black spot on a white board. We can then say that every perception entails contrast, selection, elimination, and value. We look one way and make a selection and preference, and that selection produces an antithesis or negation. Selection entails preference and value. Elimination implies contrast as a precondition of value. These may be just nascent values, yet that is to be expected when explaining the origins of value. So we are looking at a comparative account of subjective or objective value in Sartre's spirit of seriousness. We have looked at value with reference to ontology, ethics, self-esteem, intentionality and sufficiency. Another and perhaps more telling context in which to understand value is that of death. Death is another instance of lack or an absence of life, consciousness and the future. I've explained elsewhere how both Viktor Frankl and Heidegger regard death as a prerequisite of meaning. Sartre criticizes this view because death is a contingent event, so it can't be essential to meaning. I agree, and thereby look to the idea of absence as non-being within consciousness rather than within life. Yet the significance of death as loss or absence in life can't be so easily explained. For Heidegger, it is the question of being that is primarily expressed in an attitude towards death. He writes that death is not to be outstripped. Being towards the end helps us to work out a kind of being of Dasein in which Dasein as Dasein can be a whole. And in my words, Dasein is thereby under constant threat of oblivion, both continuously and ultimately. Heidegger describes this as being face to face with the nothingness of the possible impossibility of its existence. And this must be faced authentically, or perhaps with care, resignation, courage or hope. But a close reading of Heidegger finds clues to his answer to the challenge of death. One, that being towards death is grounded in the value state of care. Two, he speaks of unsupported by concernful solicitude towards death, giving meaning to life. And three is a possibility of being which Dasein itself has to take over as an authentic choice. For Heidegger, the absolute impossibility of existence must be taken up as a possibility of life. These are three features of the value state of care and its qualification by unsupported solicitude in the face of death. They are also features that are consistent with the principle of a certain independence or sufficiency of value. Firstly, Heidegger grounds the problem of existence as death or non-being in the value state of care. This is consistent with my own view of resolving the problem of human existence in terms of value. Secondly, the idea of unsupported solicitude is also consistent with independence from social endorsement. This view is sustained by many of Heidegger's statements, such as an aversion to a lostness in the they-self of superficial and illusory social interaction, and being released from the illusions of the they as the unexamined thoughts of others. And thirdly, the prospect of death strips away superficialities, leaving Dasein naked and without support. That is, the prospect of an absent future leaves us to the resources in our present value states. Cognitive outcomes and conceptions of the future are inadequate in the face of death that lacks a future. So Heidegger's analysis of human existence in the face of impossibility and of death leads back to the notion of value, and an analysis of Sartre might be said to lead to the same conclusion, but by the pessimism of his answer. In conclusion, we can again ask, why does Sartre's repudiation of the spirit of seriousness miss a more vital point? We've seen that the spirit of seriousness isn't just a condemnation of taking subjective values as objective. It's also a condemnation of an inauthentic flight from freedom and responsibility. Moreover, Sartre explains this as appropriating things for their own sake, which implies a relation. That is, a relation of intentionality between mental states or value states and their cognitive objects. But paradoxically, Sartre doesn't take up this relation in terms of a phenomenology of consciousness. He promises instead to write a future work on ethics that he never writes. One explanation of this kind of account was that he defined value in terms of lack or absence, and he thereby doesn't seem able to consider value in positive terms like magnanimity or moral fortitude. Another explanation lies in his dualistic ontology between conscious being for itself and physical being in itself. Sartre sees mankind locked in a useless passion seeking the permanence of physicality. But this relation is contingent upon both the agent and the theorist accepting this account. But there's an alternative interpretation to that of consciousness seeking the permanence of physicality. That is, replace the permanence of physicality with a more appropriate goal of a sufficiency of value. Yet the credibility of replacing Sartre's pursuit of being with the pursuit of value isn't only a question of ontology. It's also a question of the adequacy of alternative accounts to provide answers in life situations, such as the issues of self-esteem or social esteem, adequacy of ethics, and attitudes in confronting death. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.